Welcome to Ultralight Startups. My name is Graham Lawler. I am the founder of Ultralight Startups and the organizer of the New York chapter. Welcome to our panel here in July 2009 on Ultralight user experience. And this is a topic that is of great interest to me and I think a number of other ultralight entrepreneurs, because having a website that people like to use makes people use it and contributes to profitability, which is, as we know, the point of being an entrepreneur, as far as I know. So it's with great pleasure that we're here today with four of New York's top, I believe the four certified top UX people in New York City, possibly worldwide, here talking about user experience, and our very own Alan Ackerman, who's been a member of Ultralight Startups for a number of months and a previous panelist himself, that is going through his own startup and his own user experience challenges and trials and tribulations around that. So he's speaking from a consumer's perspective, as I think probably a lot of us in this room are, of user experience. So with that, I'm going to introduce Alan, and we're going to start our talk today. So Alan is founder and CEO of A-List Placements, a digital media recruiting firm since 2003, and recently launched the Hire Syndicate, a private social network that enables recruiters to collaborate on placements and share commissions. Prior to founding A-List, Alan was an independent technology recruiter and software developer. Alan spoke on the Ultralight Startups Employment-Related Business Models panel in March of 2009, and has been an active member ever since. So thanks very much, Alan, for agreeing to moderate this panel, and I'll leave it to you.
Great. Thank you, Graham. I want to start off by asking a question. By show of hands, how many entrepreneurs out there right now have launched or are in the process of launching an entrepreneurial website? Okay. How many of you have incorporated or plan to incorporate user experience practices into your website development? Okay. How many of you have already prior to building the site? Okay, a few hands. Well, would you pay to have a house built without a blueprint? That's fundamental question, and that kind of speaks to, for me, one aspect of the need of user experience. And I experienced this firsthand with my ultralight startup, going full speed ahead, building it without that blueprint. And that's part of why I'm excited, very excited about this panel tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. On our far left, we have Alex Kirtland. Alex is a partner and user experience consultant at Usable Markets, LLC. He has worked with multiple startups and small companies such as Moto Research, SchoolNet, InTrade, and DonorsChoose.org. He has also worked with larger companies such as Ford Motor Company, leading the redesign of Ford.com in 2000, where he worked as user experience lead while at Razorfish. By the way, I think 75% of our panel, if not 100% of our panel, has worked at Razorfish at one point or another. Okay. In addition, he writes the blog Usable Markets, where he tracks the intersection between markets design, usability, and user research. Next up is Karen McGrain. Karen is a senior partner at Bond Art and Science, a user experience consultancy, where she has worked with startups including WorkStreamer, Signal Patterns, and Women on the Web. She is also Chief Design Director for Buzzer, a startup company building an easy-to-use, hand-hosted platform based in Drupal. In addition, Karen is a faculty member at the new MFA program in interactive design at SBA. And formerly, Karen was VP and National Lead for User Experience at Razorfish, where she led major redesign initiatives for clients such as the New York Times, Condé Nast, and the Disney Group. Next up is Whitney Hess. Whitney is an independent user experience designer based in New York City. She helps make stuff easy and pleasurable to use. She's a strategic partner with Happy Cod and user experience consultant for Botsy, among other startups, agencies, and major corporations. Whitney writes about improving the human experience on her blog, Pleasure and Pain, and can pretty much always be reached on Twitter at Whitney Hess. And finally, Mr. David Sansone. David is Director of User Experience at TBWA, New York, a top 10 brand management agency, and part of the Omnicom Group. David's clients include American Express, Hoffman LaRoche, Purina, Elite Coffee, Dior, L'Oreal, Nissan, Sprint, Visa, and Bank of America, quite a few. Prior to TBWA, he was art director of the broadband site for Fox News and Sports. David received his MFA in Computer Science at the Art from the School of SVA, and has a diverse background in both systematic information architecture and creative interactive design. David was also the user experience professional that I engaged in helping with my ultralight startup. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about my experience with user experience. First off, as a recruiter with A-List Placement, my company, we placed a number of user experience professionals, from information architects to usability analysts. So that was sort of my introductory to user experience, and it kind of gave me a cursory understanding of what it's all about. What really, again, hit home was with development of my latest developer in the room, and he's asking me, well, where should this menu item go? Or what does this button do? And how should this work? And we're just making decisions on the go. And the project was quickly kind of spinning out of control. And that's when I realized we needed to get a user experience professional ASAP. So I'd like to kind of start with our first slide. So here's the focus of the panel tonight: user experience. Okay, this massive subject with a myriad of different definitions and terms, and we're going to do our best to kind of distill and define it, and kind of explain what it is, or at least start to do that. Why is it important? Okay. Which elements of user experience are most relevant to an ultralight startup? For example, one user experience type of document that is created is like a persona. There's certain needs that really speak more to larger launched websites with lots of traffic, and then others that really speak more to a startup. And lastly, what are the best ways for an ultralight startup to implement these elements? So let's start with defining what user experience is. Thank you, Karen. So Wikipedia describes user experience as the creation of the architecture and interaction models which impact the user. The scope of the field is directed at affecting all aspects of the user's interaction with the product, how it is perceived, learned, and used. Well, that's pretty straightforward. We're going to move on to the next slide, which that Wikipedia entry also states that user experience can sometimes be conflated with usability, information architecture, and user interface design, all of which are components of it. So I kind of took this to help structure sort of the slides and the direction of this panel, and to kind of focus on these three pillars. Now there is more to user experience, and I think our panelists are going to help to kind of add and accentuate that. So why don't we start with the next slide? And at this point, we're going to kind of talk about this, but also it's interactive time. So folks, if anyone wants to ask a question, or the time as we go through this, just raise your hand. Okay. So information architecture, and actually, why don't I start with one of our panelists to talk about information architecture instead of me just continuously rambling on. Let's go to one of the experts, and Whitney. Why don't you speak a little bit about information architecture and what's involved with that?
So, as Alan said previously, user experience is kind of this umbrella term that is somewhat accepted in the field, largely accepted, to describe a variety of activities that take place. And one of those subsets is information architecture, and it's often what's commonly used on job postings, and it has a lot of history, especially in the first .com boom. Really, information architecture can be described in a lot of ways, but the way that I like to describe it, explain it, is that it is the organization of information on the site. It is putting things into categories and creating hierarchy. It's also creating a flow through the system so that you have a beginning, middle, and an end to the process that you're trying to bring your user through. It's really creating a structure and creating a system, navigation, organizational elements, so that the person that comes to your site understands why they're there, how they can accomplish what their goals are, and ultimately how to get from one point to the next. A lot of the ways that that's articulated is often through documents like sitemaps, which is essentially a tree diagram that shows all of the key pages in the site, shows how those pages relate to each other, what pages are linked to which other pages. It's an inventory, essentially, of every page.
Pardon me, if I may. We actually have some sample documents, and since you mentioned it, why don't we switch to that? I thought it was a good idea. A lot of folks might not have seen some of these output documents that user experience professionals, in this case, I think it falls under the information architect realm. But if we can actually go back to the first, well, that's a process. Let's go down one more, sorry. Okay. So Whitney was just talking about a sitemap. So there we go. So this is a sitemap that was produced from my project. You know, at this point, actually, David, why don't I turn it over to you to kind of describe what the sitemap is and what it does?
Sitemap, what it is and what it does. Just so there's a little background.
Be sure to speak up if you could, David.
Yeah.
Everyone, because it's really hard to hear tonight.
Can you guys hear me in the back? No? Not at all? All right. I'll stand up.
There you go.
Guess we can all stand up. When I first started working with Alan, Alan was already through your first build, pretty much.
Yes.
And as he had said before, sitting down with the developer, his developer said, you know, you're at certain points in your project, I'm not really sure what's going on. So what a user experience professional may come in and do is help you basically map out, get into the minutia. So you have a set of documentation that you can give off to your developers, or you may give off to your visual designer, to basically have a roadmap to follow, as opposed to going into a development meeting and you have an idea about what you want to do, and you're trying to explain. So what has to happen at that point is your developer has to guess at what you're trying to get done. And that may not be what you have in mind. So you're going to spend some money, you're going to get something developed, and it's not going to be what you envisioned. So with the sitemap here, and the documents that you're going to see are probably, they're a hybrid of a couple of different things. So on like a much bigger project, you're going to have much more delineated documentation. This one is a combination of setting up a traditional site architecture, the tree, but it's also kind of crossed with user roles. So within his site, there are certain things that only, you know, a manager or a super admin can get into. So this is kind of paired with this key on the lower left.
Okay, and actually before, while we're going through this, I just want to ask at this point, are there any questions? Grant?
So does this literally list every single page on the site? Is that the objective?
This lists every single page on the site, yes. I mean, there might be some lower lying sections. I mean, there might be multiple pages within a process, but at a very high level, yeah, this represents...
And the organization there is how people navigate through the site, or is...
Yes, it would be. Absolutely.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, with a couple of the previous slides, but did you mention which tool you use, like what platform you developed it, or is it a Photoshop?
Or which tool did you use for this?
This was used, was made in InDesign, but you can use Visio, you can use Omnigraphal.
No, I mean, if you could, because some of them look very structured. I can tell that this wasn't, so I thought that this is just a random thing somebody was drawing up on the boxes, but a couple of the previous ones, they have a hierarchy, so if you could point at what tool you use.
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we go to the first one, Karen, if you would. And this is a process flow, so is this what you are...
This is a Visio or?
No, this was all produced in InDesign.
Okay.
Okay, all right, so what I'm just to keep things flowing and get all of our panelists involved. and this is not sort of the plan, but we're just winging it. Alex, if you can perhaps just describe what a process flow is, and maybe talk a little bit about...
I get the exciting stuff.
Okay.
A process flow is really just a series of steps about how the user is going to accomplish a particular task. So if you have an e-commerce site and you want to figure out all the different steps or what is the process that user is going to go through in order to check out and purchase their particular product, you might put together a process flow which would help you figure out all the different options that are available to you in that flow of checking out and purchasing the product. You can have multiple flows for a particular site, and that's what a process flow is. It's not really that exciting. It's pretty
Excellent.
simple.
Well, I mean, just, you know,
That's exactly what it's about.
folks want to know that. So if we can just go to the last slide, please, Karen. And this, I understand, is not officially a wireframe, because my understanding, a wireframe doesn't have the content in there, so this is kind of a pseudo wireframe. Is that right?
Pseudo wireframe. I would call this a cross between a wireframe and a style guide. So the problem that Alan had is that by the time I was analyzing his site, 90% of it had already gone into production, and you were in between developers. So usually if you have a site map, if you're working with a visual designer, the visual designer is also going to produce a set of documentation. So when it goes to your development team knows what colors to use, what kind of fonts are being used. Your visual designer is going to set up rules such as maximum width, maximum height. These are the kind of pixels you're going to have to like space things out.
Okay.
So when it was brought up before that, you know, user experience is this very broad, encompassing field. You can have people that can be very much on the creative side of things under user experience, and you can have people that are very much more systematic oriented. Basically, for lack of a better word, software developers.
Okay. So let's move on. Let's go back to the presentation, please. Does anyone have any questions?
I think it's
maybe a clarification for
Yeah.
people who aren't familiar with user experience and UI. Maybe you can talk about what sort of documents you can expect to get from a user experience UI person,
Okay.
and maybe what they mean and how they can help you with your website.
Okay. Great. Well, I'm gonna turn it over to Karen to address that.
So the question is, what documents can you expect to get from a user experience designer?
That's correct.
So, you know, the scope of work for every project will vary. I would say typically, when I work with a client, the main thing that they're looking for is wireframes. You know, it's really to have someone come in and sketch out the blueprints for how the pages should be laid out or how the navigation system should work. In addition to that, oftentimes I'll work with a visual designer who will then prepare design comps and a style guide. And on top of that, there's often a number of other documents that go along with the process. So a page inventory is a particularly popular one. Sometimes I'll do a sitemap to show it in a visual diagram, but oftentimes it's just as efficient to show it in an Excel spreadsheet that, you know, it's a little bit easier to read. A lot of times we'll do user research or usability testing work, and so there will be documents that come out of that. And kind of even further upstream, a lot of times when I work with a client, we don't just dive right into wireframes. We'll spend some time doing some strategy and some concepting work to say, you know, what do you imagine this site will be like? What do you expect people are going to be able to do there? And then document that really in just like a PowerPoint presentation that says, you know, this is the goals and the purpose of this site. Here's how we expect people to use it. This is, you know, what value we expect people to get from it. And having a document like that, I think, is really useful for the whole team because it gives you something to put a stake in the ground and say, this is the product we're making. We're not making this product.
Okay. Any other questions?
To that end, can you speak a little more about personas, why they're valuable, and when strategically you want to introduce them and their value throughout the life cycle of the project?
So personas are a document that you would create to articulate who the user of the site is, or the users of the site are expected to be. And they can be a really helpful tool for a team that is maybe not that in tune with who their users are. A lot of times, people have a really great idea for a product, and they're like, my idea is genius, and everyone will want to use it. And pulling back and saying, okay, let's think about, what type of people do we want to have come to the site? What are their goals? What are they expecting to achieve here? And documenting that with like a name and a face and a little story and a description of, why they are coming to the site and what they expect to be able to get accomplished there, can bring the team into more alignment about who you're building for and, in some cases, who you're not building for.
Okay. Question?
I've seen you there earlier, you get a bit of a feel for the range of various web projects that people are involved in here. So with that in mind, what range of expense would you think that people should be looking at for the elements of, if you like, design and user experience within a bootstrapping startup?
Okay, I'm going to actually...
X to Y.
Okay, I'm going to... Whitney, perhaps you want to address that?
So I work with a lot of startups that are based in New York, and I also work with major corporations. And I wouldn't say that the price is scaled based on that spectrum. The price is determined by the activities that a user experience designer is going to undertake in the process. So we've talked a lot about the documents that are created by a user experience designer, and I might propose that you shift the way that you think about it a little bit, in that the document is important, in that it is often the place where decisions are articulated, where everyone can agree that this is how we're moving forward, that there's a certain lifespan for that document so that it can be shared between members of the team. But really it's the work that you did to create the document that has the value. So the thinking that went into it, and the decisions and the testing and validation with actual users, that's where the real value comes. And so price can be determined just based on how intensive that process is. So some of the activities that Karen mentioned, like developing wireframes, developing personas, doing usability testing, we're actually watching people use a build of the site or a prototype or even a series of sketches, doing research that informs what the needs are of your users. All of that can be done in 2 weeks, or it can be done in 5 months. And obviously that will affect the price of the engagement. So there are ways you can do things iteratively, so you can make small improvements over time, and there are ways you can do things holistically, where you really take a step back and you try to approach the problem at the high level. So there's no easy answer for it's going to cost between $100 and $10,000.
No, I totally understand, but if you mind just to clarify.
Sure.
You've got to feel for the general sense. There's very few people here that are built with Google Maps, right, or Google Earth, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got a general sense of the sort of area that a lot of people in this room are operating in. So obviously the upper end is most probably $300,000, right? What's the lower end? Or less. Exactly. The point is X and Y. Where are X and Y plus or minus 150% going to be?
Personally, I would say the lower end is free because you could do it yourself.
Okay, all set. Well said.
So let's do ourselves.
Well, and then that's part of what we're going to talk about. But let's just hold off. Let's continue a little bit just to keep the flow going. So actually, I'm sorry if you can just go back for a second just to finish this off. So. So we mentioned some of the tools, entrepreneurs' resources. We mentioned these, and actually I'll ask Karen. I think IxDA. I put IA Instituted because you can actually post if you're looking for an information architect. I looked there. I mean, didn't have great results, but there's one option. Karen, if you can maybe mention what IxDA is. Did you
IxDA is the Interaction Design Association. They also are heavily involved in the user experience field, and are a great organization as well.
Okay, cool. We mentioned some of the tools here that are used for, someone was asking. And then the output, which we actually saw a couple of samples of. So why don't we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, user interface design. So actually, Alex, turn to you. Can you tell us a little bit about that, why it's important and what it's all about?
So by user interface design, this is really kind of the visualization of what you would like your site to look like. So this is when the graphic designer comes in and interprets what the wireframes are and will tell you kind of what is the visual language that will make up your site. And graphic designers too have a set of skills, so they could just be good at doing kind of the graphic design piece, or they could have much more of a feel for the interaction of the site or how something is actually going to function or work. And usually there's a discussion that goes on between your information architect and your graphic designer about how does the features and the organization of the site itself get implemented, or how does that interaction actually work? So if I want to submit a form, how does the interaction with that form really work, which is a little bit different than what are the elements of that form. So an information architect would be much more specific about defining the information and kind of where it goes and how important it is. And the graphic designer would be a little bit, definitely kind of how it looks and it feels, but also how is that interaction going to take place? What is the transition going to be like from one screen to the next screen? And so that's interaction design or user interface design.
Okay. Any questions? Yes.
How do you get to that point where you have crystal clear criteria? Okay, this is exactly what we need. For example, when the first iPod came out, I think they specified you only have 3 clicks in order to navigate the system. So how do you get to that point where you know, okay, this is exactly what we need to do. This is kind of what it should be.
So,
please.
Yeah, I mean that's actually a great question. Usually, a lot of information architecture is usually something that doesn't. If you're building something, you don't want to start doing your information architecture. You want to think about what is the experience going to be from a holistic level. What are we really going to build? What problem are we really trying to solve? And how do our users perceive that problem? And how do we think that we're going to make it easier for them to solve that problem? So this is where user research and other sorts of more strategy thinking goes on. And you might have a personal vision, and you might do some user research, and you may discover how people think about this particular problem. And you might combine your insights from that type of research with your own personal vision, and you come up with a vision for the site, or design strategy, if you will. And part of that design strategy would combine whatever maybe you feel is necessary. Maybe it has to be 3 clicks. Maybe that's something that's important for your vision, and it might be derived from the insights that you have from your users. So maybe there's some piece of information that's critical that or some task that you're solving for them, or you're allowing them to be much easier. So that's really defining that vision is really kind of the first piece of it, and there are all sorts of tools and ways that you can do it. And part of one of the things that drops out of that too is a list of features and functionality. So at a certain point, you have the vision, you know what it's going to be. You could build the kitchen sink if you wanted to, but you're not going to build that. You need a set of features and functionality which are going to align with that vision. So part of translating what your vision is into what the wireframes are is figuring out what it is exactly you're going to build.
Okay. Please.
Talk a little bit about research and so forth. What are some specific activities that someone like an early startup could do as part of research for design?
Maybe another one.
I just want to ask a question. So, of those of you who have actually built your product, raise your hand if you spoke to a prospective customer while you were designing the site. Okay. So for those of you who didn't, why? And it's okay. Why did you move forward, and what was the thought process that you had as you were designing the product without customer input?
Anyone want to take
No
that?
one wants to take that.
Go ahead.
Well, we're designing a product for coaches that's tech oriented, and a lot of them have no idea what's out there or what's even possible. they can barely use smartphones, forget about, you know, a complicated statistical or video analysis tool. So for us, our job is to just go in and create as easy an interface for them to use, but we couldn't really get too much input from them.
So that's a perfect example, I'd say, of someone who could do user research. So what is easy for one person is not necessarily easy for another, right? So probably everyone in this room can change the time on their VCR, but not everyone in the universe can. There are plenty of people who only still watch movies on VHS and have the blinking 12 o'clock. So if you know that your users, your customers, have a different mindset than you do, have different technical capabilities, have different behaviors and lifestyles, then it behooves you to actually talk to those people, to get a sense of what their needs really are, because they're going to differ from yours so greatly. It's going to give you a lot of insight into what features you have to make available, and particularly when throughout the process, how to ease them into the process so that they feel comfortable, so that they feel like you're really guiding them and that they trust you throughout the experience.
Yeah.
One thing this wasn't relevant to my company now, but prior when done stuff we sometimes find is going to a potential user with a blank sheet of paper is just a recipe for disaster. If you go to them with a spec, right, or something that is, you know, kind of there, right, you're still engaged in the conversation, but you have something they can react to. As opposed to saying, well, how do you like to watch TV? You can say, okay, you know, here's an interface. Is it easy to use or not? Right, so you are kind of engaging with them, but maybe not straight away. Right. And I think for some of the people building, you know, really alpha early stage site, maybe that's the stage.
Every project is going to be different, and sometimes it's appropriate to go with your users with what your vision is. Sometimes it's appropriate to have a blue sky conversation. I will say though that in all the years that I've done usability testing, I've never had an experience where I haven't learned something that's really like totally took me by surprise, and that totally was incredibly useful for the people who were building the site. So no matter, I mean, if there was one piece of advice that I would give, it would be, you know, do some sort of usability testing, whether you either hire someone or whether you do it yourself or whatever, because those insights are gold.
So, to your point, when you're dealing with something as broad as how do you watch TV? I mean, Boxy is one of my clients, so I actually did research on how people consume media through their television and through their computers. And so I didn't ask anyone, how do you watch TV? Because when they self-report, it's not necessarily going to be accurate. But I said, can I watch you watch TV? And I went to people's homes and I actually saw what's hooked up to their TVs, what components they use, what game consoles they have, how big the TV is, what environment it's in. That's a bunch of information that you can get from just going into one person's house that you didn't have. The whole ecosystem in which your product is used, whether it be on a TV or on a computer or on a mobile device, you don't have any of those insights until you talk to people and observe them.
Okay.
One point I want to make, I mean, if you are going to do testing on your own,
Can I ask the panel to yell?
if you're going to do testing on your own, it's important to make sure that you get a group of people that are not familiar with your projects. That's one really important thing, because if someone's already familiar with what
which product or project,
if you're developing a website and you're going to say, all right, I can't afford $2,000 to go out and hire someone to do some like quick user acceptance testing for me, I'm going to ask my buddies. Your buddies probably know what you're doing. What you need to do is ask your buddies to come and basically check out what you're doing, because they're not going to have a preconceived notion about what you're doing. That's basically the point.
I just have a question. When you said something, interesting, you said that you can't expect accuracy from users who self-report. Can you elaborate on that, maybe? That they have to be observed rather than asked? I guess that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, so if you ask me what I typically eat in a day, I would probably tell you something very different than what I actually eat in the day. So people have a lot of reasons why they're not willing to share information whether there's kind of like a taboo around it, or they simply don't even know themselves. So I think that often by observing people and by asking probing questions to get at underlying problems that they're experiencing and what they did yesterday as opposed to what do you usually do, it gets you much clearer insights about what their actual behaviors are. So surveys are great, but people are gonna put one of the 4 things down that you asked, and it may be that they don't do any of those 4 things. And if you lead them in a closed-ended conversation, do you do X? They're gonna say yes or no, when if you ask, how do you do this, then potentially you can dig and get into more detailed, more accurate information from them.
So since we're on user research and testing, is that something that an ultralight startup in general can do by themselves, or under what circumstances would you need to hire a professional for that?
Yes. I think it's a myth that user research and usability testing is this like expensive, complicated thing that nobody can do, or that like only if you're a big corporation can you afford to do this.
You can tell me how much you can do.
I did not.
This is a site,
Go ahead.
would anyone recommend usertesting.com? It's the site where you'll pay them $30, they'll have one person, you get a video of them using the screen as you go through and talking. Is that valuable or is it worthless?
Do any of our panelists have experience with that?
I haven't used that. Well, I'm sure it's probably valuable, but it's usually worthwhile to have some set of guidelines when you have a conversation with a user. So what's usually typically not very valuable is you go up to someone and you say, what do you think? And just let them talk.
Do you like it?
Do you like it, right? Because they're going to say, yeah, great, But, so it's good to have some set of tasks or a structured conversation to help guide the person through the site and will yield kind of more actionable insights. It also allows you to assemble a group of insights across multiple users because you're kind of taking them through the same set of tasks. So a typical task might be, find War and Peace on my book selling website, and then you just watch them and you see how they do, you see where they go.
You know the book Don't Make Me Think?
Yes.
And that's an excellent book.
There's a script in there.
Yes.
20-page script for doing yourself.
So if you want to do it yourself, I would buy that book.
Usertesting.com I don't think has a lot of validity, and not just because I have something against their company, but in general. Why would you choose to not interact with a prospective customer? Any opportunity that you can take to get to know someone who could potentially be a customer for you, you should take yourself. I think you should suffer through seeing how unusable your design is. I think you should be able to ask them questions and probe when you see their reactions to things. You should see them sweat. I've done usability testing sessions where people have cried because they haven't been able to accomplish a task. And it sounds funny, but people think it's their fault. And you have to kind of experience that to really internalize how important this stuff is and to empathize with the people who you want as customers. So I would caution you against using a service like that.
Fair enough. Are there any of these services that you would recommend, maybe some mentioned here or just in general that you can recommend? Or any of our panelists for that matter?
I've used Silverback. It's great. I highly recommend Silverback.
Can you describe what Silverback does?
It is, it's for the Mac. It is a tool which allows you it captures the movements of the mouse on the screen. So if you ask people questions, you can see what they're trying to do. It also uses the built-in camera so you can see their face and kind of where their eyes are going and things like that. And it records the session, audio, video, everything.
Are you there in person watching it and it's recorded, or is it remote?
Yeah, and I think that's important. There has to be, Whitney's point is important, that you really want to be there in some form, whether you're doing it remotely or in person. You want to be there watching them, seeing how they react to it, developing empathy with your users. I think that's a great term. Understanding kind of where their head is at, how they perceive what you're trying to do.
Okay. Question?
Do you have any advice on how to get people to help test your site? Because like I kind of feel like it's hard enough finding actual users for a site that's done. Like you're saying that we should be trying to find people who will test out a version of your site that isn't even done yet, right? Like, is that
people are enormously willing to help.
How to get people to do usability testing for you, to be participants?
like while you're still working on the site, like while it's still being designed?
Yeah, I think you just, I mean, I do that all the time with, I mean, you know, I'll test a piece of paper that I drew on with a Sharpie. And, you know, I think people are enormously willing to work with you, especially if you say, hey, this is a product that's in development, and rather than building something that doesn't work and then finding out after we built it that it sucks, we're going to talk to people now. And so what I want you to do is pretend that this is a real website. And imagine what you would click on, or imagine how you might use this. And people think it's fun. And also, if you give them free beer or a sandwich, they're more than happy to give you your opinion.
I bet there are 10 people in this room that would be willing to be usability testing participants for you, especially if you offered to be one for them.
Okay. Who would be willing to be a usability tester? There we go.
There you go.
All right, right after the panel. We have a question over here.
Yeah, I got two relationship-based questions. How do you ensure, I guess anecdotally from your experience, how do you ensure that if you hire a graphic designer separate from the wireframe designer, how do you ensure that that relationship is a good one, that they work together well? The second question is, when you're setting up the terms of engagement with the user interface designer, how does the entrepreneur know, and what sort of guideposts does he have to know that the project is now complete? That we're not going to do multiple iterations for 2 to 3 weeks or months or 6 months, and now we're ready to move to the next step.
I think to your point, I'm going to address your second question, and maybe someone. My guess is most of the people here, ultralight startups, it's technology, and in technology, you often are having iterative builds. So at a point, you have to draw a line in the sand and say, if you're doing iterative builds and you want to get to a point where you're going to push something out, you have to reach that same point with your documentation if you're going to engage someone who's a user experience professional. So I think when I had my working relationship with Alan, it's important to have a discussion if you're going to seek outside help about what your expectations are. You need to get a gist, because you may then say, you're going to negotiate the price, you're going to negotiate the kind of documentation that you're expecting, or you may be in the middle of the project and what you're really doing is you need some band-aids. So the person's going to come in and do an analysis. At a certain point, you don't necessarily want to go back and retroactively change your information architecture documentation to reflect what you've been doing. That might be a waste of money. It depends. It also depends on what you build, how your build structure is being done. If you're working with people in the United States or you're using outsourced development groups, you need to make sure that your documentation is pretty tight. You may be doing part of your build here, but doing another part of the build in the Philippines or in Ireland or in Russia. I mean, that's just the nature of the market. I'm not sure if I really addressed your question, did I? To a certain degree.
Were both of your questions addressed?
No, the second question would be, how do you ensure that the relationship is a good one between your graphic designer and your user experience architect?
The question was?
The relationship, if you're hiring both a user experience designer and a graphic designer or visual designer, how do you ensure that both of those people work well together? I mean, I think the easiest way to do it is to hire a team of people who have already worked together. I typically don't work with, if somebody's hiring me and they also want graphic design, I typically recommend strongly that they work with somebody that I've worked with before, just because if you're hiring two strangers who have never worked together, then you're paying for their time to learn each other's style, and that's a challenge. But if that, for whatever reason, you have to do that, then I think to this question and also to your previous questions, like somebody's got to be the decider, like the George Bush decider. And it's tough if you have two people who are making design decisions and there's not a clear sense of who actually has the ultimate say. And you know, sometimes it might work better to make sure that one of those people is more senior and maybe distinct, and you know, someone can clearly come in and say, be the one who says, okay, this is good, we're going to ship it, or okay, this isn't working, and we got to take another pass at it.
I'm sorry. One thing I would say is important if you are going to engage two different people is the one thing I've run into oftentimes, you know, working in agencies in the past, you know, you put together a group of documentation, I've sat with the client, we basically hashed out, you know, everything has to be on the page. The one thing that you need to be on top of, because visual designers, not all visual designers, this might be a gross generalization, but it's happened to me in the past, that they might decide to take something away because it makes for a much more pleasing experience. But taking that something away is something that you've asked for. It's something that, if you've gone through the process to hire someone, you've made wireframes, you've got process flows, et cetera, and you have a visual designer that's gonna be like, I don't really like that button. It kind of throws everything off. I can take the button away, it just brings a lot more breathing space to my design. At that point, you might be taking away a very valuable piece of functionality, which is not to say that you should shut down your visual designer. The visual designer might have a very valid point for taking that thing away. At that point, you should engage in a discussion with them, but that has happened.
Okay. Back?
What are examples of great user interfaces that you go to for inspiration? The question?
I've always liked the BBC. I think they've got an excellent site. They've always had invested a lot of time and effort into making a really usable interface.
Well, let's hear from each panelist on that one.
Fresh Direct is one of my sources of inspiration. They have found a way to enrich the online experience in the way that the web works better in a sense than the supermarket. So supermarket is a multi-sensory experience. You can smell stuff, you can squeeze stuff to see how fresh it is, and you lose that when you're shopping online. But I can't slice open an orange at the supermarket without paying for it. On Fresh Direct, I can roll over an orange and see what it looks like on the inside. So they really took into consideration the ways that the web can provide more value when so much value is lost from that in-store shopping experience. And I just think that the flow is really clean. At the very end, they have giant, you must click here to confirm your order, because they had this kind of a disconnect between the confirmation screen and the you actually submitted it screen. And so they're not trying to be pretty, they want to make sure that you know you submitted your order. So I use them for a lot of inspiration.
I think Mint is really good, mint.com. They are like an account aggregation service that if you haven't used it, you type in, basically they are a service that persuades you to give over all of the login and password information for all of your bank accounts. And they make it seem fun. They do, I think their public-facing website is a great example of content strategy. Their messaging is really clear. They are very persuasive as to why this is a great tool. And then when you get inside and you actually start using it, the data visualizations are really compelling. It's really easy to set up and use. It's one of those things where if you've ever used your bank website and it sucks, and then you go in there and you all of a sudden find like, oh my God, I'm using this and I'm enjoying it. So I use that as an example, kind of a lot.
I think I would say WordPress, which certainly the latest version is a lot better than some of the previous versions, but it's pretty good. I know they've done a lot of user research to make it better, and usability testing. So that's a good word for it. One of the things that they've just transformed so many people who were never writers before into writers, and I think that the fact that they can do that and make it easy to manage your website and make it easy to build your own personal website, all that, I think is really pretty impressive. So as a publishing system and as an application, I think it's it's pretty good.
Okay. Someone?
Can you talk a bit about differences, maybe different situations or different things you learn out of user interviews, surveys, observations versus A/B testing, analytics, multivariate tests? I mean, do you use those in different situations or are you using them in parallel? And what kind of problems do you use to solve with each one? Kind of more analytical versus more observational and softer.
Good question.
So there's a phenomenal book by Bill Buxton called Sketching User Experiences. And he has a phrase in there which I use a lot, so I want to give him credit. He says, getting the design right or getting to the right design. And I see user research as getting to the right design. What are people's needs? What are their behaviors? What motivates them? What frustrates them? And so things like interviews and observations, in some cases surveys, where you're getting information about their lives, that's figuring out what is the right design to work for these people? How are we going to reach them? Once you've got a sense of what your feature set is and what the flow is going to be, things like web analytics, A/B testing, using Google Website Optimizer, Crazy Egg, whatever, all those tools can help you get the design right. So what is most effective in the interface? Are we converting the user? Are they able to understand the difference? You really have to first make sure that you understand what the right design is and then get the design right. Does that make sense?
Can you say the name of the book again?
Sketching User Experiences by Bill Buxton, B-O-X-T-O-N. Phenomenal.
Getting analytics right, I can just say one word about analytics. I mean, analytics it's a tough science to master. And there's a lot of data, and it's easy to read things into the data which may not be there. So analytics would, measuring kind of statistics about your site is most useful to see, kind of uncover issues that you might be having, right? But they're never going to tell you why you're having particular problems. So in that case, you might resort to usability testing to figure out why are people, not finishing this checkout process. The analytics will tell you that people are having a problem, but they won't tell you why. So it's important to really think through how you're using analytics, and they should be used in conjunction with other forms of user feedback. They should never be done kind of as your sole way to gather user feedback.
Question?
I want to ask a fuzzy question about taste. When we hire a designer, especially a visual designer, certainly user experience, there's an element of taste. Like, we like it, we pay a lot of money. I would try to set up a lot of time out. How do we gauge that? How do we select the user experience person? Assume that person's good. A certain person that's following the methodology that has worked for them in the past. How do you factor that in? Is it important? Is it all about user? What about our own choice criteria? I like rounded corners. I don't like rounded corners. How does that get into the
Karen, I'm going to...
I think any designer wants there to be some grounding to the design. They want to be able to start from some basic principles that say, we are designing an application for this audience. Our brand has this personality. Our business goals are to achieve these things. And if you have that kind of grounding, it makes it a lot easier to work through some of those types of taste issues, because it then gives the designer the chance to say, I didn't just do this because I like it this way. I did this because we discussed earlier that these are our values for our business, and these are our brand attributes, and this is the type of user we're trying to achieve, and so therefore I did this, and this way. I think it can be enormously unproductive, and frankly, time-consuming and expensive to spend a lot of, do a lot of wheel spinning around whether you like rounded corners or not. And I think the time spent up front to set those principles in place, and then agree among your team that you're going to listen to what those principles are and try to abide by them. It may seem like it's wasted work up front when you're just like, no, I really just want you to start designing something. But it actually saves you a lot of time in the end.
Any questions over here?
Brad, you have a question?
Okay, so kind of to the ultralight theme, if there was, it seems like when you're talking about user research and testing, that a lot of that we can do ourselves, either the observational stuff or the analytical stuff using Google tools, for example, for free. If there was one thing you said, like an entrepreneur or someone that's not trained in this is not going to be good at, or that you really, you know, the top thing that you need to hire a professional for, what would that be?
Why don't we ask Alex? I'd like to hear from you.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, so, you know, one person can master user research, they can master usability testing certainly, but at a certain point there's only so much that you can kind of do. And maybe as the founder, your expertise lies in designing, you know, maybe you were a designer in the past life. So part of who you hire depends on kind of what your own skill sets are and what you would like to be doing. I mean, I've been hired by people who don't, like at some point, you know, they don't want to do the actual design because they want to maintain a certain distance, right? You know, so they're happy to be kind of more of a project manager, product development role, right? And they just want to bring in an information architect, and that's what they want to do. Other people, they just, you know, they're happy to do design. They've got skillful front-end designers, and they really need help with usability testing, you know, and that's what they want you for. So it really depends on what your own set of skills are and what you feel comfortable doing and learning, and so it's not a really good answer, I suppose.
Are there other answers to that question?
I want to second what Whitney said earlier, which is you're not hiring somebody to make deliverables for you. Your goal is not deliverables. Your goal is not usability testing. Your goal is not wireframes. Your goal is to have a product that works the way people expect it to work and that will make you money in the end.
You may not have the time to do all these things, so that's why you might look to a consultant to help you. But if you do manage to have all the time in the world and you have the resources on hand, then go for it.
Or maybe a better way to, I mean, because like my initial reaction after having dealt with Alan's project was like, oh, the process flows, because that was his #1 problem. But if you analyze that against what Karen suggested, it's like, you know, it's not about your end deliverables as far as like, I'm handing you off wireframes, I'm handing you off process flows, I'm going to tell you that you need to use 18-point type everywhere so your user knows what's going on. For Alan's particular thing, the problem was the process flow was because, you know, the juncture of getting from point A to point C, point B was not there. So what he engaged me to do was that, and the end result happened to be a process flow. Someone else I talked to last week has basically got their entire online application done. Their major problem there is when you get to their homepage, you don't know what the product's about. 95% of the people think it's one thing when it's actually something completely different. At that point, you know, you're doing user research. So, yeah, you can't just pinpoint that, like, it also, the onus is partially on you guys as the founders of the company. Maybe at a certain point you have to analyze, it's like, okay, where is my broken link? Is my broken link my marketing? Is my broken link that, you know, people can't buy my products? That would give you a clue of like maybe what you need to look for.
Okay. Question?
Maybe Graham's question might be more useful to sort of turn it around and say, especially with small startups, what do you think is the most likely thing for them to overlook when they are trying to do the user experience process? If they are trying to pay attention to it, what are they most likely to miss? And I feel like that might have been answered right in the beginning with just talk to your potential customers, but if there's anything besides
I mean, there are a couple different pitfalls that you could fall into. You know, one is not knowing your user well enough, not spending enough time with your user. And I think that's important to make sure, particularly, I've run into a lot of people who say, like, I know the user, you know, I've been the user, I know exactly what they are, you've all heard this before, right? And we don't need to do user research because, you know, and so then you get to, the first thing you do is design. And at that point, you know, then it's like, it's difficult to argue with that because some people feel very firm about that. At that point, you want to push them to start doing usability testing early on paper prototypes, and really just pushing them to start getting feedback sooner rather than later. So that would be one thing. I will say also, if you're using an offshore team, this is a little bit skipping from the beginning to the end of the project. If we're talking about execution, if you're using an offshore team, you definitely want an information architect to come in and do really detailed schematics and functional specifications, because that's going to save you a lot of heartache. So that's one very specific piece of advice.
Go ahead. Oh, Whitney?
I was going to add, I think the biggest pitfall that I've experienced with a lot of my clients, particularly startups, is that you've already fallen in love with your solution. So you've got an idea, this is what I'm going to build, it came to you one day in the shower, and now you are convinced that that is what the world needs. And I would recommend taking a step back and saying, okay, what is it, why do I want to build this? What problem is it actually solving? Why do I think how is this useful? And then try to understand more about that problem and try to objectively decide if the thing that popped into your head as the solution is really going to fix that problem in the long term. So I think that that's probably the biggest thing that I've seen, that people just want to go full, speed ahead with whatever that one feature was. People's way along the way, and you have to have a lot of humility to accept that might have been your big idea, that might have been how you thought you were going to innovate. But one of the things that I like to say to my clients is don't try to innovate with new features, try to innovate by actually giving people what they need.
I have a few slides here that I put together.
Yes.
Like
We're
things I've learned.
Okay.
That might be.
In addition to the ones that are on this?
No. This.
Okay. All right. So we're going to wrap up pretty soon. We'll take maybe 2 more questions.
Sure. These don't have to be like the very last thing we do.
That's kind of the plan, but
a little bit more about the Interaction Design Association.
I wonder why.
Okay, so 2 of us actually are from that organization, and on Thursday, July 16th.
Is there a question?
Well, I just want to let people know that
Well,
next
actually,
session.
if you have a question, then I'd say please ask it. But if not, we need to move on to another question. Any other questions? Okay, last question.
You guys are talking a lot about how to approach UX and IA when people are starting out. What if someone has a really bad site that just doesn't work for users? Like, this is something I run into, and they're like, well, we already spent $5,000 on it. Whatever. I mean, what do you tell them? Kind of convince them that they really need to fix it and make it awesome.
If they're getting lots of customers who are paying lots of money, then it doesn't matter if it's a bad site, does it? If they have no one giving them money and they're spending lots of money on building the thing, I think you've got a pretty good reasoning for them to consider changing something.
I mean, or if you have, can you just say, look, principles of UI say that this sucks, or do you have to show them analytics that say, look, your bounce rate is really high, or
Usability testing is a great way to communicate that. It's one thing to have a consultant come in and be like, your website is terrible, and also you should pay me a lot of money to fix it. And it's quite another to go out and find a half a dozen of their customers and sit them down and record some video of their customers saying things like, this makes no sense to me at all. I want to close my browser and never come back to this website ever again. If you hear a handful of people say that about your product, you start to think, hey, maybe I gotta do something about this. Hey, that consultant over there, I could pay her some money and she could fix it for me.
Okay. So Karen, if you would at this point, please.
So I have worked with a number of startups, and I wanted to put together, I have some things I want you to know about working with a user experience consultant. And so I want to start out by saying there are lots of really good reasons to hire a UX designer. One of the best ones is that you're like, I need someone to draw pictures of things that our developers are going to implement right now. But that's not the only reason. You can hire a designer to create concepts for you that are not going to be built, but that you can use to illustrate what your product can do for investors, or to help explain to people what it is that you want to create. You can also, so it's like the audience for the UX work might be your development team, it might be investors, but it might be you internally. You might hire a UX designer to come in and think about, let's brainstorm and document and prioritize all the things that we want to do. And I've been hired by clients to do all of these different things. But frankly, if you're an ultralight startup, I want to say the only reason that you should be hiring a UX designer is if you are going to have them make designs that you are then going to hand to your developers. And so coming out of that, the main thing that you guys need to be aware of is that you cannot sit around drawing pictures of things that you're not going to start building. And I know every single one of you right now is like, oh no, I am an ultralight startup and I have laser focus on doing things super efficiently and super lightweight. And you're like, I want to build a bicycle and I am going to hire somebody and they're going to draw a picture of the bicycle and then the developer's going to build the bicycle. And you're going to work with the UX designer for like 2 weeks, and then one day you're going to sit in the meeting and you're going to be like, what would it look like if it had wings? What if we made it want to fly? It could fly, right? And then like 2 weeks later, you are designing a picture of the Starship Enterprise. And you're sitting around and you're having a really awesome time because it's fun to look at pictures of websites. It's fun to go through the design process. It's fun to imagine what this product might be. And the problem is that you will spend, weeks imagining new features and coming up with new ideas and saying, well, what if we did this, and what if we did this, and what if we did this? And in the end of it, not only are your developers not building a product, but when you do hand those designs to the developers are going to be like, well, we can't build all this stuff right away. What are we going to build first? And I think the discipline to say, like, if we, let's not waste any time drawing pictures of stuff we think we're not going to build right now, or if you do want to do that, go back to the previous slide and say it's perfectly fine to draw pictures of things you're not going to build, as long as you're very explicit about what you're doing. Don't confuse, things that are going to be implemented with things that you're doing that are just concepts. Second thing I want you to know is that you have to design for the users who are going to come to your website, not for the users who you're hoping someday will come to your website. A lot of the problems that I see startups today have, because everything's social and everything's community and everything's about your friends, is that they build this site, or they try to design a product that's like, oh, it'll be awesome when everybody comes and everybody starts signing up their friends and everybody's using it. And on day one, when someone comes there, the experience isn't that great because no one signed up for it and no one's using it and they don't want to sign up their friends. And people treat this sometimes like that's a customer acquisition problem. Like, oh, well, we'll make it go viral. And oh, well, we'll just get a bunch more people to come to our site and it'll be great. But the problem is it's not a customer acquisition problem. That it's not making your funnel bigger, getting more people to come to the site isn't going to get more people to sign up and start using it. And so you really need to think about what the experience for someone's going to be when they come to the site and there's maybe not that many people using it. And you might actually have to design for the interim and think about creating, an interim experience for people that will be there when things aren't as robust. Because you're thinking about, okay, I'm not just designing right now for how the site's going to work when it really works. I'm going to design right now for the site that's working when it's not working all that well. And then finally, and I think this is probably the biggest challenge for entrepreneurs, although you might not want to admit it. It's like, I'm sure this product for people is their baby. It's like something that they've been, obsessed with, and, it's the focus of your whole life. And it's like one day you've got to let your baby get on that school bus and like have other people take care of it and teach it, and it's going to learn new things that you're not going to be responsible for. And one of the biggest challenges that I have in working with startup clients is that they'll come in and they'll say, the first thing they always say is, oh, I know I'm not a designer. I know design is not what I do, and I really need a designer to come in and help. And then you start presenting work to them, and they can't quite articulate why they don't like it. And even though you're designing things that are based on principles, or it's a better experience, they can't quite say what's making them unhappy. And the problem is usually that it just doesn't look the way that they would design it. And sometimes, sometimes clients are great and they're like, wow, you solved my problem. And then other times clients are like, well, I just really wish it was, can't you make it look more the way it did? Or can't we go back to the way it was before? Or let's sit here and argue for a long time about rounded corners or, how big the font should be. And, at a certain point, you have to be willing to say, you know what, I'm going to put this product in and put the design of this product in the hands of somebody who's an expert at it so that I can be freed up to actually run my business and go out and get the users and get the revenue that I need. And that means, letting your baby go off into the world. So that's what I want you to know.
Excellent. Well, at this point, I definitely want to thank Karen.